Hey guys, the year is 1763. The guns have gone quiet. Deep in the forests of Pennsylvania, the last echoes of musket fire are fading, and after 7 brutal years, the French and Indian War is finally over. American settlers had fought alongside British redcoats against French forces, against their Native American allies, through blood and mud and frozen winters stretching from the Ohio Valley all the way up to the icy shores of Quebec. And when the smoke finally cleared, Britain had won. The French flag was gone from North America. The Union Jack flew from Hudson Bay down to the Florida Keys. But here's the thing about victory. It always comes with a bill. Back in London, a man named George Grenville sat staring at ledger books, and what he saw terrified him. The war had cost the Empire nearly £70 million. The national debt had doubled. Interest payments alone were swallowing half the government's annual revenue. And on top of that, 10,000 British soldiers were still stationed across North America, costing another £300,000 every single year. Someone had to pay. And Grenville's eyes drifted west, across 3,000 miles of ocean, toward the very provinces London had just bled to protect. Meanwhile, the Americans were celebrating. In Virginia's smoky taverns, planters were buzzing about the rich Ohio Valley lands now ripe for the taking. Pennsylvania farmers dreamed of their sons building homesteads in the western forests. Boston merchants were already calculating profits from new trading routes. These people had fought in that war. They'd mortgaged their futures for it. Surely, they figured, the fruits of victory belonged to them just as much as to any lord back in London. Then came the Proclamation of 1763, and it hit like a blade through the heart of every American dream. King George III simply declared that colonists couldn't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The lands they'd fought and died to win? Off limits. Reserved for Native American tribes, most of whom had fought against the crown. Veterans expecting land grants got nothing. Speculators who'd bought Western claims were suddenly holding worthless paper. That invisible line stretched from Canada all the way down to Georgia, and it felt less like a boundary and more like prison walls. In Williamsburg, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry read the proclamation and seethed. In Boston, Samuel Adams, not yet famous but already a brilliant political organizer, saw something else entirely. He saw grievance. And he understood that grievance, properly handled, could be turned into something much more powerful. But the proclamation was just the beginning. George Grenville needed money, and he needed it fast. So in 1764, he pushed through the Sugar Act, a duty on molasses, sugar, and other imports. To the bureaucrats in London, it seemed perfectly reasonable. To the merchants in Boston and New York, it was a disaster. For decades, colonial traders had operated in the comfortable grey zone of Crown law. Customs officials, underpaid and far from London's watchful eye, had been flexible. A few coins in the right hands, and a technically illegal shipment became perfectly legal. Smuggling wasn't crime, it was just how business worked. The Sugar Act ended all of that. Royal Navy patrols multiplied. Enforcement became relentless. Men who had built their fortunes on creative trade practices suddenly found themselves labelled criminals. But even that wasn't enough to truly ignite things. That spark came in 1765 with the Stamp Act. Unlike the Sugar Act, which mostly hurt merchants, the Stamp Act reached into every American life. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, dice, pamphlets, college diplomas, marriage licenses, nothing escaped. For the first time, London was demanding money not through trade regulation, but through the simple act of living your daily life as a British subject. To American lawyers trained in English legal tradition, this was horrifying. Since Magna Carta in 1215, one principle had been sacred: no taxation without representation. But colonists had no seats in Parliament. They sent no delegates to the House of Lords. So how could Westminster claim the right to tax them? The question tore through colonial assemblies like wildfire. Parliament's answer? Something called virtual representation. Every member of Parliament, they argued, represented not just his local district, but the entire empire, colonists included. Benjamin Franklin, then serving as America's agent in London, listened to this argument and barely kept a straight face. Virtual representation, he noted, was about as useful as virtual food to a starving man. The Stamp Act also brought something else that would poison colonial relations for years: the Quartering Acts. British soldiers stationed in North America needed housing, food, supplies. Rather than cover those costs from the royal treasury, Parliament simply ordered colonial governments to provide them. When public buildings weren't enough, private citizens had to open their homes to uninvited soldiers. For free men raised on English rights, nothing was more offensive. Tavern keepers had their establishments commandeered. Homeowners found their property rights meant nothing when the army came knocking. Every red-coated soldier on a colonial street became a walking symbol of subjugation. And so, the pushback began. In Boston, Samuel Adams founded the Sons of Liberty, a name borrowed from a speech by an Irish MP who'd praised the Sons of Liberty in America. Adams knew exactly what he was doing. Successful resistance, he understood, needed both secrecy and spectacle. The Sons of Liberty met in private and acted in public, organizing protests that looked spontaneous but followed carefully orchestrated plans. The network spread fast. New York had Isaac Sears. Philadelphia had Charles Thompson. Charleston rallied behind Christopher Gadsden, whose yellow flag, coiled rattlesnake and all, bearing the words, "Don't tread on me," would become one of the most enduring symbols in American history. They perfected political theatre. Stamp distributors who accepted their appointments found furious crowds appearing at exactly the right moments. Effigies hung from liberty trees, symbolic executions that served as very real warnings. Tar and feathers waited for customs officials who proved too eager in their duties. The message was unmistakable. Cooperating with British authorities came with consequences. But resistance needed more than street theatre. It needed ideas. In Virginia's House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry introduced resolutions challenging Parliament's authority to tax Americans. His words became legend. "If this be treason, make the most of it." Massachusetts went further, calling for an intercolonial Stamp Act Congress. In October 1765, 9 colonies sent delegates to New York. It was the first coordinated intercolonial political body since 1754, and it produced something remarkable. The delegates drew a careful constitutional line. Parliament could regulate imperial trade, yes, but taxing colonial property directly? That violated everything English liberty stood for. London thought the distinction was conveniently made up. The colonists thought it was obvious. And running parallel to all of this, something even more important was quietly taking shape: the Committees of Correspondence. Samuel Adams conceived of it in Boston, but the idea spread like veins through a body, connecting town to town, colony to colony. When British authorities acted against someone in one place, word travelled through the network instantly, allowing coordinated responses before officials could exploit colonial isolation. For the first time, a farmer in Georgia could learn within weeks about a tax protest in Massachusetts. A Philadelphia merchant could read detailed accounts of customs enforcement in Charleston. 13 separate societies were slowly, quietly, beginning to see themselves as something unified. George Washington, not yet committed to resistance, let his Mount Vernon estate host meetings for the Fairfax County Committee. Thomas Jefferson, still a young lawyer, found that committee work was sharpening the constitutional arguments that would one day define his life's purpose. John Adams contributed legal expertise that gave colonial opposition a language British lawyers couldn't easily dismiss. The debate over loyalty versus resistance split colonial society right down the middle. Neighbours argued. Sons defied fathers. Anglican clergy counselled obedience to the king. But Congregationalist ministers in New England, Presbyterian pastors in the Middle Colonies, Baptist preachers across the South, many of them saw British policy as a threat to religious liberty as much as civil rights. The Great Awakening of the 1740s had already taught people to question established authority and trust their own conscience. That lesson transferred very naturally to politics. Meanwhile, the Stamp Act was quietly collapsing under its own weight. No colonial stamps were being sold because no one dared sell them. Courts shut down rather than operate without stamped documents. Newspapers ran skull and crossbones symbols where stamps should have been. British merchants, watching colonial boycotts drain their profits, began screaming at Parliament for relief. Ships returned to English ports with holds full of unsold goods. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Bells rang in Boston. Cannons fired in New York. Toasts were raised to Good King George. It felt like victory. But on that very same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, quietly asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The underlying question hadn't been answered. It had just been postponed. Samuel Adams read the Declaratory Act and understood exactly what it meant. Britain had retreated tactically, but not strategically. The repeal was real, yes, but the empire had not given up its claim to unlimited authority over the colonies, and the colonists had just proven they could resist. Both sides had learned something dangerous about each other. The storm wasn't over. It had barely started. As ships carrying news of the repeal sailed west across the Atlantic in spring of 1766, almost no one on either side of the ocean understood what was actually set in motion. The Proclamation of 1763 had planted the first seeds of resentment. The Sugar Act and Stamp Act had nurtured them. The committees of correspondence had built the roots that would carry everything forward, and the Sons of Liberty had given it all a pulse. 13 colonies that once barely spoke to each other were beginning, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably, to see themselves as Americans. They were still British subjects. Most of them still felt British. But something had shifted. Something new was being born in the forests and cities of North America. A political community that could imagine resistance, organize opposition, and sustain defiance against the most powerful empire in the world. The fuse had been lit, and no one, not in London, not in Boston, not anywhere, fully grasped how short it was. But London didn't stay quiet for long. While colonists were still celebrating the Stamp Act repeal, a new chancellor named Charles Townshend was already back at the chessboard. He'd noticed something interesting in the colonists' arguments, their careful distinction between internal taxes and external duties on trade. Fine, he thought, let's test that theory. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed new duties on glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea. Not dramatic declarations of conquest, just quiet levies on the building blocks of everyday colonial life. A family couldn't avoid stamped legal documents if they chose to, but they couldn't go without windows, walls, and writing materials. And Townshend added something even more insidious. Revenue from these duties would now pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies, cutting the colonial assemblies completely out of the loop. For generations, assemblies had controlled executive and judicial salaries. A governor who defied the legislature risked his paycheck. A judge who enforced unpopular laws could find his salary suspended. That leverage, that financial check on arbitrary authority, was now gone overnight. Imperial officials would answer only to London. Colonial merchants organized the first systematic boycott of affected goods. Non-importation agreements spread through the correspondence networks built during the Stamp Act crisis. Why buy British goods when local artisans could supply the same? Economic warfare became patriotic virtue. Women emerged as central players in ways no one had quite anticipated. Household purchasing decisions, traditionally a female domain, became political statements. The Daughters of Liberty organized spinning circles and turned homespun cloth into a symbol of resistance. Drawing rooms that once served fine imported tea now offered local herbs. Hostesses who once prided themselves on fashionable British imports now competed to wear the plainest domestic fabric. But in Boston, where British officials were most concentrated and enforcement most aggressive, things moved faster and uglier than economic boycotts. Customs officers armed with sweeping search powers were tearing through warehouses and private homes. Merchants who'd spent their careers navigating the grey areas of colonial trade were now being systematically targeted. When officials seized John Hancock's ship Liberty in June 1768 on suspicion of wine smuggling, the city erupted. Riots forced customs officers to flee to a harbour fortress for safety. Governor Francis Bernard called for troops. That October, British regiments marched into Boston, not to repel a foreign invasion, but to police American citizens. For the first time since 1689, armed soldiers patrolled the streets of a major colonial city in peacetime. Soldiers competed for jobs and drove down wages for working men. Off-duty troops drinking in taverns clashed with locals who viewed every redcoat as a symbol of oppression. Catholic Irish soldiers attended Mass in a fiercely Protestant city. Every interaction was a potential spark. Samuel Adams documented all of it. Through his committee networks and newspaper essays, written under classical pseudonyms, he catalogued every incident of military misconduct, every arbitrary search, every violation of traditional English protections. He wasn't just recording history, he was building a narrative. A story of systematic tyranny that would justify extraordinary resistance. The explosion came on a cold March evening in 1770. A British sentry outside the custom house struck a young apprentice who'd insulted him. Word spread through Boston's narrow streets. A crowd gathered. More soldiers arrived. Snowballs and insults flew. Then someone shouted fire, and muskets discharged into the crowd. 5 people died that night in King Street. Crispus Attucks, part African, part Native American, a dock worker. Samuel Gray, a rope maker. James Caldwell, a sailor. Samuel Maverick, 17 years old. And Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant who held on for 9 more days before dying from his wounds. Samuel Adams called it the Boston Massacre. The name stuck. Paul Revere's engraving of the event circulated throughout the colonies within weeks, showing disciplined soldiers firing into helpless civilians on command. Trial testimony would largely contradict that image, but Adams wasn't interested in nuance. He was interested in impact. The legal aftermath was actually more remarkable than the event itself. John Adams, Samuel's cousin, agreed to defend the British soldiers. Despite everything, he believed that fair trials demonstrated something essential about American values, and he largely won. Most soldiers were acquitted. 2 received reduced sentences for manslaughter. Americans had separated their outrage at imperial policy from their respect for legal process. Boston won and lost, and won again, all in the same year. Parliament, under pressure from both colonial boycotts and British merchants losing money, repealed most of the Townshend duties in April 1770. They kept only one, the tax on tea, as a symbolic assertion of parliamentary authority. Many colonists called it a victory and moved on. Adams knew better. The constitutional question, Parliament's claimed unlimited authority versus colonial rights, hadn't been resolved. It had just been shelved again. And Adams had learned something from 2 cycles of crisis and partial repeal. Partial victories were dangerous. They dissolved the popular energy needed to push for complete change. The next confrontation would need to be different, more focused, more dramatic, harder for moderates to walk away from. He didn't have to wait long. In 1773, the East India Company, crown jewel of Britain's commercial empire, was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Years of mismanagement, expensive territorial ambitions in India, and fierce competition had left the company drowning in debt, with £17 million of unsold tea rotting in London warehouses. Lord North's ministry crafted what seemed like an elegant solution: the Tea Act of 1773. The East India Company would sell directly to American consumers, cutting out the colonial middlemen entirely. The result? Tea cheaper than anything in the market, even cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that had dominated American commerce during years of boycotts. Surely Americans would embrace cheaper tea. They didn't. Because the Tea Act didn't just offer cheaper tea. It destroyed the livelihoods of every colonial merchant who had built his business on tea importation and distribution. It handed a London corporation a monopoly on one of the most consumed goods in North America. And once that precedent was set, an imperial monopoly on tea, what would stop Parliament from extending that model to cloth, hardware, agricultural products? Colonial merchants weren't being offered a deal. They were being shown the future of their irrelevance. Groups that had been divided on constitutional questions suddenly found themselves united. Merchants who'd opposed boycotts because they valued trade relationships now faced economic elimination. Smugglers who'd ignored political protests because they profited from illegal trade now faced company competition that made their business impossible. Even moderates who'd been willing to live with imperfect compromises couldn't stomach this. The response began in Philadelphia, where residents organized to turn tea ships away from port. New York followed. Charleston allowed the tea to land, but locked it in public warehouses where it couldn't be sold. And in Boston, things were about to get considerably more dramatic. Because Boston had Governor Thomas Hutchinson, and Hutchinson was not going to back down.